We're going to get started, and I'm going to hand it off to Professor Tatum, who will be moderating our next panel on tribal co-management of federal public lands. All yours.
Begin by introducing the panel now. They're on the panel. For the past century, failing federal conservation policy has forcibly evicted Indigenous peoples from their ancestral lands to create protected places like national parks and national monuments. These forcible evictions eliminated a legally recognizable property title, but they did not eliminate the connection and the relationship that people have to these. And so Indigenous people today are serving at some of the highest level leadership roles in the federal government, responsible for protection and management of this land. And 35 years ago, the U.S. Supreme Court issued its Lane decision, and in Lane, the court ruled that Indians could not stop commercial timber harvesting in the federal public lands were managed by the U.S. Forest Service, because that would give the Indians a veto for what is, after all, the government's own land. Rather than fighting the death knell for Indigenous efforts to have a say in the management of these lands, Lane actually provided a spark for legislative change. Beginning with Medicine Wheel and Devil's Tower, federal land managers began inviting tribal governments to participate early on in the process of developing management sites. And that gave tribes a voice in the early stages of the development, rather than just timing it after it's already finished its plan. And today, thanks to Indigenous-led advocacy efforts, land management recognizes the injustice of this possession and develops a framework to center tribes as decision makers in the co-management of their ancestral lands. This panel will discuss opportunities in the existing federal legal framework, tribal co-management of lands, assess the challenges in the implementation, and we'll take a look at the future and what the future of these agreements can be. First, before I ask the panelists questions, start by introducing our panelists. I believe we have online Monte Mills. Monte joined the University of Washington faculty last fall as the Charles Stone Professor of Law and the Director of the Native American Law Center. Prior to joining the UW faculty, Professor Mills was a member of the law faculty at the University of Montana, where he also served as co-director of the Indian Law Clinic. Before joining academia, Professor Mills was the director of the legal department for Southern Ute Tribe, Colorado. Professor Mills' research and writing focuses on the intersection of federal Indian law, advocacy, and natural resources, as well as race and racism in the law and legal education. He's the author of several law review articles and co-author of two textbooks. He's also the co-author of the book, A Third Way, Decolonizing the Law of Social Protection, which was published by Cambridge University Press in July 2020. We also have online Ms. Majel Russel. And Majel Russel was raised near Lodge Grass and was pro-Indian reservation in southeastern Montana. And is an enrolled member of the Pro Tribe. She earned her law degree from the University of Montana and is a founding partner of her law firm, currently represents a wide variety of government and tribal organizations. Before entering private practice, Ms. Russell was the chief prosecutor for the Confederated Salish and Hopi Tribes, where she prosecuted adult and juvenile offenders and fish and game violators. In 2007, Ms. Russell took a one-year leave of absence for service deputy, parental deputy assistant secretary, of Indian Affairs in Washington, D.C. And our third panelist is Mr. Craig Andrews, who is the vice chairman of the Hopi Tribe, bear claims in the village. I'm not even going to try to pronounce it. I'm sorry. Yes, I would want to go not to try to pronounce the words. And a member of the various years Tribal Coalition. Vice Chairman Andrews is a Marine Corps veteran. He's previously served as tribal council secretary. So thank you to all three of you for being here today. We start by asking about what you see. What is tribal co-management? Mr. Andrews, what do you see as what it means for co-management with you, and talk a little bit about working in bears here?
Thank you. If I may, I'd like to stand up a little bit here. We have a moment to use it, Papa, and the few hundred, and when we use it, the Kapo in the Mobian Yard, the Kang, it's a Pinaki among Hit, and I'm not with the Kanan. It's here now, Mamma San. So with the Mamachi was Kang without Kulatan. When the Piloma in Mayan Pimatua, when the young Kituki answer who speaking of Masanga, when the Pionoma. So good evening, everybody. I hope everyone had a really good meal here. Thank you to all the people who prepared our food for us. You know, that's re-energized and talking a little bit more about our symposium here and specifically here right now with Bears Ears. So I introduced myself as Lomahinma, which is my Hopi name given to me when I was first born. And it refers to corn as our staple, our livelihood, which we use constantly within our ceremonies and in all aspects of life or what we're doing. So it's Lomahinma, meaning that fresh corn, as soon as it comes up from the ground, wherever you plant, you just see nothing but this fresh sprouts of corn that are out there. So that's what I was named after. From the village of Masangnabi, which is located in the second base area there on Hopi. And just great to be here and part of the symposium. Honored to be serving as the vice chairman for the Hopi Tribe. This is my first term, and I've been in the position of vice chairman for a little bit over a year now, maybe about a year and 4 months. So I'm fairly new to, not new to tribal government. I've been also a council representative for 2 terms, and then also a chair for our board of directors for our specific village of Masangnabi. So that kind of brought me to the position I'm at now. I don't have a large array of background in academia like a lot of the individuals do, but I've come from a village aspect and just an individual that's wanting to do better for our village and for our people. So that's really where I came from, and it excelled from there. Yes, I've served in the Marine Corps 4 years, and that was another part of, that I had gone through, and just being here with you all and within, I don't know how many attorneys that are here now, and kind of get a little intimidated when I see attorneys in a large room here. Just because of the fact that we're with attorneys, we're having to educate our attorneys and also attorneys that represent us in Bears Ears, and also the agencies that we have to work with. We're having to teach our cultural side to agencies, and as a matter of fact, we just had our sensitivity training last week with the agencies, and it was a very big showing of the agencies, BLM, U.S. Forest Service, and one other partner which they have is SWCA, which also showed up, because we have to, as I heard earlier today, we're having to teach our culture, our side, to the Western society of how we see all these landscapes from a cultural perspective. And I believe that's where the question comes up here that I was asked, how do I see co-management? So co-management is sharing our thoughts. Sometimes I don't want to get to that place of negotiating. Really, it's a teaching on our side to the agencies that are there across the table that are listening, hopefully listening to our side of the story of why we hold these sacred sites so dear to our hearts. Of course, Hopi, I'll talk about a little bit about Hopi specifically and where it touches just Hopi, and then I'll go ahead and touch on the tribes that are comprised of the commission here. So Hopi, of course, I'll talk to Hopi first, is that we've set footprints out there in all of the 4 region, in the 4 corner states up in the northern region area. So archaeologists right now are saying we have a village out there, which is the village of Ojaivi, that is the oldest inhabited community in the North Americas. So it's still standing. It still has people there. We're a living museum. I like to see it as a living museum because of the areas of sites out there that we're trying to protect and talk to. Really, we're still living that culture. We're still living in those homes that was built centuries ago. You go out there and all you people will see is, oh yeah, there's another ruin there. We don't see it as ruins. We see it as somewhere we inhabited. Our culture, our clans had migrated through there. And they've never left. They're still there. They're still there in spirit. And our songs, our tradition, our ceremonies, all talk to that. So this is why I'm here to kind of explain. And this is why I was selected, I guess, from the chairman's office as far as being the representative for Bears Ears. And he goes, you know about the area with your teachings from your uncles and your grandfathers of those areas up there with all the cultural resources that we have. People are only seeing nothing but recreation. And I'll talk a little bit more about recreation later, but people see it as recreating. In fact, to a lot of the indigenous tribes, not just only the 5 tribes that are there, that's what you would call church for us. That's where we go to connect with certain spirits, medicine that was talked about earlier by another panelist. That's where we go to connect, which in turn are songs of that whole landscape. And not just the Bears Ears region. This is Grand Canyon. This is areas of Staircase Escalante. We just talked about Oak Flats. Oak Flats, we supported with our tribe as supported the Apache tribe in connection with and communication with Chairman Rambler. That's a chairman for that tribe. And we did a letter of support to keep mining away, because there are cultural areas out there that we are tied to in those areas. And because Apache is there, we're speaking alongside them, with them. And so I think maybe I'm a little bit more rambling on, but I want to just go ahead and talk about Bears Ears Commission. So there's 5 tribes to this, and there's Zuni, who is Councilman Sanchez Jr. He just got into the commission not too long ago, maybe about a month ago. And so there's a change of leadership in our commission as well. So Navajo, on the Navajo side is Council Delegate Yanito. He's also new. And then our Ute Councilman, Mr. Lehigh. He's a part of that. He's been there for quite a while now too in this commission. And then the Ute Indian tribe of Uinta and Ori. His name is Representative Councilman Mr. Tabi, and he's from the Uncompadre band of the north of the Ute, Northern Ute tribe. So those are the commission members that are currently now serving in the capacity of the commission. And the Bears Ears InterTribal Coalition, we have Charissa Majesty Wilson, and then also Hillary Hoffman. I'm sure somebody all knows Hillary Hoffman, and then Lauren Henson, and then Liberty Kinzel and Ruben Pacheco. They comprise of the coalition who assists the tribes in moderating, setting up meetings with agencies. So maybe I can stop there and then have the rest introduce themselves. Or thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Russell, could you talk about what meaningful co-management looks like to you? How it works in the ITBC and how it's different with bison herds than it is with land management?
Yes, thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. I wish I was there in person. I have been working with the InterTribal Buffalo Council for many years, and the mission of that organization is to restore buffalo to tribal lands. And it's to restore buffalo to tribal lands to be raised as wildlife on those lands. And co-management has become a very critical component of that work as we are trying to make inroads with the federal agencies on how buffalo are managed on refuges, national parks. And co-management is, in our sense, talking about dealing with everything from herd health to herd handling to culling herds, and tribes having some role in all of those critical management decisions that really basically determine the number of animals that are going to exist on those lands. We've had agreements with several national parks to engage, and a lot of times those agreements are limited in what the role of the tribes will be. So that's been frustrating, but real quickly, I know to move on. Restoration of buffalo to tribal lands is a very healing and emotional endeavor for tribes. You know, as you know, the buffalo existed on this continent in huge numbers, and those buffalo sustained our Indian tribes pretty much all over the Western region. And that buffalo were critical to survival of our people. And so with the near eradication of buffalo, it was consistent with the way our tribal people were treated in this country, and almost, eradication of some of our populations. And so we have very difficult history with, killing the buffalo is the same as almost killing our Indian people. So when we do restoration efforts, it's a healing ceremony that allows tribes to basically rekindle the relationship they have with buffalo from a cultural and spiritual component. And then in the modern day, buffalo can be useful for economic development as a traditional food source, to get our people back into eating a healthy food source that is traditional for them. And so the restoration effort is very vibrant right now, very strong, and so many tribes are endorsing the concept of returning buffalo. Also, real quickly, I also want to say that buffalo are very useful for conservation. The way that buffalo are on the lands, they're friendly to the lands. They're a keystone species to a lot of our Western lands and grasses. And so they're very friendly to the earth and much friendlier than domesticated animals such as cattle, horses, sheep. And so there's also a major conservation component to restoring buffalo to those lands, and also to the efforts in the parks to maintain those lands, which are sacred to many of our tribes.
Mills, they follow up with you, and Dr. Mills, may I ask you, do tell us a little bit about what from a legal perspective, what co-management is, and then I'll go back to Ms. Russell and have you talk about how the management of bison differs from land. So I'll have Professor Mills talk a little bit about how legal what is co-management and how does it come in, how does it work?
Yeah, happy to do so. Thank you so much, Professor Tatum, and just honored to be a part of the panel. And like Majel, wish I was there with you in person, but glad to be a disembodied head in 2 dimensions in the room. So, and good to see, I know I saw some familiar tops of heads from the room shot earlier. Good to see some friends. A couple of things, and this kind of goes back to what Vice Chairman Andrews said about attorneys perhaps, and having to educate the federal government. There's really a distinction, I think, between what most folks refer to and think of as co-management in practice and the way it's been defined, particularly by the federal government in terms of legal authorities and the way it can play out on the ground. All of the things we've already been talking about, the ways in which tribes can exercise their voice, their interests, their priorities for the management of public lands, counts as co-management. And the more that the tribal interests begin to have an effect in the way that those lands are managed is on the ground and practically co-management. Unfortunately, the federal government has taken a narrow view about, as a legal matter, what constitutes co-management. And that dates back, at least officially, to 2016 in a secretarial order from then Secretary Jewell, which was very positive in terms of promoting collaborative and cooperative arrangements with tribes, and highlighted a number of the legal authorities that federal land management agencies could rely on to engage in collaborative or cooperative management with tribes. But that secretarial order said in particular that they were not talking about co-management, and that co-management in their view, that definition was narrowly referring to only where the federal government was required to delegate some decision-making authority to a tribe or otherwise obligated pursuant to a congressional act or maybe a national monument proclamation or a judicial decision, for example, and the secretarial order used as an example, the treaty rights litigation in the Northwest here and the co-management of the fishery resources that resulted from that litigation. And so even though I think the discussion about co-management is far broader than just those areas where Congress has specifically authorized it or where the federal government is obligated and necessary to delegate some decisional authority to tribes, that's the narrow definition that the federal government has provided in 2016. More recently then, in updated secretarial orders and even guidance from the Solicitor's Office at Interior, the federal government, at least officially, has begun referring to all of the scope of tribal engagement as co-stewardship and maintain the very narrow definition for co-management from that 2016 order. And I think it's confusing, and it really gets into making distinctions that may not have much of a difference, because as we've already heard, and I'm sure you've heard over the course of the symposium, what really matters is the ways in which that engagement is happening and tribal voices are influencing what happens on the ground, whether that's returning bison to the landscape, managing bears ears, or any number of different ways in which that can happen. Nonetheless, at least as a technical legal matter from the perspective of the federal government, unless there's some clear authority for the federal government to delegate some authority to tribes in terms of decisions, or otherwise require tribal decision-making from congressional acts, that's not technically co-management. Those are the only things that count. Everything else they view as either cooperative arrangements, co-stewardship, everything else. The last thing I'll say about all of that is what makes that all so confusing is that everybody just calls it co-management. And there's been a lot of folks getting sort of tripped up about the legal standards and their use of terminology instead of really focusing on the priority, which is how can everybody do better to ensure tribal voices are having an impact on the decisions that are made. So I don't know if that helps or causes further confusion, but I think that's the situation, at least as a legal and technical matter, that we find ourselves in.
Ms. Russell, the ITBC has been around for a long time and has had agreements with several national parks, such as Yellowstone and Grand Canyon. How do you think, tell us a little bit about how you work with the federal government and what lessons perhaps other tribes can draw from the strategies you've developed?
Thank you. That is a very good question to just follow up on Professor Mills's statement. So initially, ITBC, an ITBC is comprised today of 79 tribes all across Indian country that are all committed to restoring buffalo. Where we get buffalo to start a lot of these herds is the federal government from national parks and refuges. And initially, we reached agreements that were very specific to just picking up the buffalo at a certain date, at a certain time, and meeting all of the standards that they set for the kind of habitat that the buffalo would go to. And that was it. We're now working hard to expand those agreements to have a little more say about numbers, timing, family groups, but that has been a real difficult process to try to expand. And exactly following up on what Professor Mills stated was initially when we started entering into these agreements, and primarily to actually participate in the quarantine process to treat buffalo from Yellowstone so that we could preserve those genetics. The United States would say all of the entities involved in management of this species at Yellowstone have some jurisdictional statutory authority for the tasks that they are undertaking. And we're having a hard time because you tribes don't seem to have a statute that empowers you to have a role here in management of the species. And so that took a lot of work in terms of trying to figure out how do we overcome that. And we have talked about how for Yellowstone, for example, all of that land was originally part of a particular tribe's reservation. It was actually part of the Crow Reservation initially. And then we talked about how treaty rights do give us access to these animals. They give us an access, not just to hunt, but an access for food source that we think extends to management. So we've tried to be creative with the government, and this administration right now has been friendly to those arguments that we have made, and we've been able to enter into expanded agreements with several different parks to take animals that they call out of the park and relocate them onto tribal lands, but also to make some decisions about how herd health, how that's managed and so forth within the parks. But that's been a tough road. I will say real quickly though, we've argued a lot that we believe that the Bolt decision, the very famous Bolt decision that talks about co-management of a fishing resource, the salmon resource with the state of Washington, that you know, the K stands for co-management there, and the tribe's right to do that with salmon. We think that the language there also really supports tribes having access to other traditional food sources and other game, and we don't think it should be limited to fish. I don't think the language actually is real specific to that. And so we've been using that case to argue that, you know, we do have a right. We think there's a legal right already established. We just haven't been active in getting recognition of that right. So I guess there's a lot missing from these agreements, but we're working hard to make arguments for tribes to have much more of just a show up here and do this, and not the overall critical issues of managing buffalo in the cases I'm familiar with.
Thank you. Vice Chairman Andrews, can you tell us a little bit about the history of bears ears? Because I've heard a lot about in the media the coverage of the dispute of whether it should be established as the national monument and what size it should be, but there's not been a lot of coverage about what the tribe's role is in co-management. Talk a little bit about how that developed and what the tribes are doing, part of the co-management process.
Yes. So, you know, as a little bit of the history on our side with that is on July 2015, this is just a timeline that I wrote down. Hopi Tribe, Navajo Nation, Ute Mountain, Ute Tribe, Pueblo Zuni, and Ute Tribe from Bears InterTribal Coalition. December 2016, Barack Obama designated Bears Ears as a national monument. Then on December 2017, Donald Trump reduced the size of Bears Ears National Monument by 85%. December 2017, Hopi Tribe files a lawsuit regarding unlawful attempt of President Trump's action of reducing Bears Ears National Monument. So there was in 2019, former Vice Chairman, Mr. Tanakova testifies before the U.S. House Committee on Natural Resources Committee to support legislation restoring Bears Ears. And in January 2021, Chairman Timothy Navangiyama sends letter to President Biden requesting the restoration of Bears Ears National Monument. October 2021, President Biden utilized executive authority to restore the land to the Bears Ears National Monument in October 2021. The Bears Ears originally had a 1.3 million acre boundary. And President Biden reinstated and slightly expanded that boundary. June 2022, the Bureau of Land Management of U.S. Forest Service and the 5 tribes of the Bears Ears Commission formalized and celebrated their partnership for co-management of Bears Ears National Monument. So with the timelines here, with my current seat as vice chairman, last year, I took up this the portion of taking this over as part of being a commissioner for Bears Ears. So before that, there was also former Vice Chairman Lomakwahu, who was the first from the Hopi Tribe to actually take on this task. So he went from Vice Chairman Lomakwahu to Vice Chairman Tanakova, and then to me now. So a lot of stuff has happened. As far as transitioning into the Bears Ears portion of it, there was a little transition as far as when I took office. So a lot of the information that I had received are from our Department of Natural Resources that was really instrumental in framing this whole land management framework out. So they were already in the mix of this. So I went to them as a resource. So I'm not in this alone in this whole management. You know, I look to my Cultural Resource Advisory Task Team, who is acronym for that is CRACT. They're comprised of individuals from villages that have a stature of maybe a position in some kind of a moment position, maybe a moment meaning a leader in a certain society or certain traditional aspect of what we do as Hopi. So they're all comprised of that. So there's like 7 or 8 of them. I look to them for that resource as far as trying to get all this information gathered. And then also to our Department of Natural Resources and our Cultural Preservation Office, which is another department that I look to. But for what Donald Trump did, we're still in the midst of that. I don't think, I'll just say that, you know, we're still in a lawsuit, which the state of Utah had implemented, trying to do away with what President Biden did. So we're still in the mix of that, and we're still not out of the woods yet. But I know our attorney isn't here, so if I speak more on it, I don't know if I'm going to make him cringe or, you know, I don't want to overstep his boundary because, you know, they're still in litigation. We just met with the state of Utah. I couldn't make it in person, but we did meet with the lieutenant governor. The governor was who we scheduled the meeting with. For some reason, he couldn't be there. So this was months in advance. So I took that as something that, you know, I hope it was a good excuse for him not to be there to talk to the tribes, because it was the 5 tribes that were coming to his neck of the woods, to his house to speak to him. So the lieutenant governor was there. So I was on Zoom, and then the rest of the commission members were there in person. But it was the same scenario. We got into their office, into their boardroom, a meeting room, and there was maybe a talk with her for maybe 20 minutes, 25 minutes at the max, and she left. So to me, that it just told me personally, this is my own personal opinion. I've told the commission about this. You know, we're led to thinking that we're at the table finally, you know, to talking to these individuals and trying to teach them how we're tied to that whole area of Bears Ears, all in that whole area in Utah. But they didn't afford us that whole opportunity to talk to them, yet we were left with some individuals that were talking on their behalf. So we were left with just people that weren't at that capacity. I don't know if they were at that capacity level to make any sound decisions. I don't think so. But just to know that we were led there with months in advance to meet these individuals, and this is what happens. You know, so there is, I don't know if that was a political move. I don't know if they were supporting, well, you know, obviously supporting possibly Trump on keeping it the way it is right now. But that was just my own opinion, and I've let the commission know about that. So just what I ran down of what the timelines of what we had done as far as Hopi. We did our part, and of course the other tribes that did their part. But we're still at the table. We're not giving up on this whole issue or this whole matter of co-management, because I mean, if that's what it takes, is a little bit of give and take, a lot of trust, and a lot of communication, a lot of teaching our side of why we're doing this. But the other part of it is, there's still agencies, what Dr. Nosey was sitting here, saying white man. I didn't want to go that far respectfully, but I think that's where it is at right now. We're on this side, in Native tribes, trying to sit with them at the table. Sometimes, I have to call time out because, it gets heated. Of course, it's going to get heated. Nobody wants to concede. But at times, we have to call time out and let them know that, we're talking, we're trusting one another at this table here. We're finally at this table where we have our input, our voice. Our voice needs to be heard to you all sitting across as agencies. Because I look at it to the future where those agencies, and I've talked about this to another individual, I want those agencies to be on the same side of the table, letting the higher up in the Senate area, up there and on the hill, letting them know that we're all a team. This is what we want. This is what we're needing as far as tribal leaders and for the landscape. Yes, recreation. I talked about recreation earlier. Recreating is fine. Recreating has been done years in that whole area. And you can see the impacts of that whole area. And that's what we're trying to restore. Because not only are they climbing on petroglyphs, pictographs, on maybe the homes, the stone ruins that are there, they're not only climbing on that, but they're going inside there. To us, that's very culturally sensitive because we still hold a lot of our ceremonies, our songs are prayers through singing. And the people that don't know much about Hopi, that's what we do as far as Katsina and a lot of our ceremonies. We still do our snake dance, which is coming up in August. And a lot of us, I'm the Bear Clan, so some of our clans are born into having to do some of these ceremonies. We don't have a say-so. That's our responsibility to carry it out. So I'm born into that. So every year I was initiated, maybe when I was in the 5th, 6th grade, into the society, into our snake ceremony. So I do that every 2 years. But those are the things that are still out there in our Kiva settings out there, which we once occupied, which is what we called home a long time ago. Those, I believe, are something, those areas that we want to protect. Not only that is the soundscape, the scenery, medicine. You can see all the resources out there. And those are the things we're wanting to protect. Now you got 10 roads leading to one area out there. We see that, we see a lot of that impact out there. And now we got what they were taught. I've never heard about it, but they were saying it's glamping, these glamorous camping that are out there with these huge $1 million RVs that are out there now set up that are just doing that. And we need to have some sort of I guess some sort of hold on that. Or say so, not to do that. Because that's, like I said earlier, that's our area of worship. Because we wouldn't go into a church or anybody else's church and ruin that and climb all over their pews or whatever in their area. That's not what we would do. But still, we still hold that so dear to our hearts out there and connect it so much. I can speak only specifically for the Hopi Tribe. And I know the other tribes are in that same, in a different way, or in the same situation. But like I said earlier, we had to do a sensitivity training to the agencies from the Hopi's perspective. Because in our Western society, as you go to school out there somewhere, even here, people are thinking, you say, yes, I'm a Native American Indian. They say, oh, you guys still live in teepees. That's kind of I guess the picture that they get. Some of these agencies, so we're all Native, but yet we have some sort of distinct cultural way of doing things. And especially for the Hopi tribe, we have to bring that to the agency so they understand. You won't understand until you walk in our area, walk in our land, and walk into the areas, even at the villages. We took them to the village. And tell them this is just like what you visited back there, which you called was a ruin. But people are living here in the same stone homes that we built thousands of years ago. We still have kivas standing there right in the midst of our villages. Those kivas are replicas of what they're seeing out there that were built thousands of years ago. And those aren't just built just to build them. They're living. And when you put prayer to that, when you take an offering out there, there's things that come alive. So if you see glamping, when I see glamping, when I see people out there recreating, I think about that. And coming from the teachings that I have, it breaks your heart, knowing that we have so high respect for these kivas when you first enter to these areas. There's a certain way and etiquette that you go into these areas, but that's how I see it, and co-managing with and having this dialogue with the agencies. Yes, it's there, and it's there's discussions going back and forth, but I feel that they're slowly getting the gist of where we're coming from. I've even brought, this is some of the goals management objectives, collaborative management planning. This is something that is Hopi's. We've already done this. So we gave this to the agencies and the Bears Commission. So some of this is we took out because there was sites actually named and located. So we took all that out and we gave this to them. They said, this is what we have. And lo and behold, they said, oh, you guys already have something in place. So yes, we had it in place a long time ago, from our teachings as far as when we were growing up. So some of this, we're going through, even through topics of vegetation, wildlife, fisheries, forest, woodlands, health and safety, even grazing, because there's a lot of cattle out there. A lot of cattle out there that are stomping all over what we would call, plants that are possibly going extinct, which is medicine to us, and stomping all over the water sources, springs going in through there. So those are the things we're really looking at to sit across the table and say, this is what we feel shouldn't be going on out there. Like I said, visual resource management, night skies, nightscapes, paleontology. Those are the issues that we're sitting down right across each other and saying, this is what we're going to teach you about landscape or about night skies, soundscapes. There's a certain time of the month in December, well, that's in December, is where Hopi feels that we need quiet time in those areas. And that's what quiet time is out on our reservation. So those, we can't stomp, we can't yell, we can't scream, because we feel that the earth of the crust is a lot thinner, because then we're in communication with everything. Some of this we've discussed. I'm kind of giving you a surface level of what is a lot more on the Hopi perspective, and a lot of these societies, they're initiated. So a lot of that we feel that we hold the whole world in the palm of our hands because they know this whole portion of I guess, being part of that society, you get initiated and everything just bronze up. So a lot of our leaders are holding themselves responsible for all of the world catastrophes that are out there. And that's how impactful it is when you go out there and sometimes I see when I coming down through here and you're passing through town, people are talking about vacation. People are talking about going out but our cycle of ceremonies is year round. So I can't make all the meetings because we're having to do a lot of these ceremonies. You know, there's only one time out of the year that we pray individually for ourselves, for our health, for me. And the rest of the time is for the whole world, all the people, heavens, everything moving. So we're only selfish one time out of that year. And that's when the sun rises, when it crests, you get done, and then it's back to praying for everybody else. So just a little bit, this is kind of the stuff that we have to teach our agencies about our cultural perspective on our side to this whole land management collaborative movement.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Let me just pick up on a couple of, everybody hear me? I think my battery in the mic may have died. Let me just go to the podium here. I want to talk a little bit about the benefits of these co-management agreements before we get into the resiliency and the future of them. But just so you can see if we can new battery for the next speaker here. Yeah. What are the benefits of these agreements and why should the federal government continue to engage in co-management? I did talk about the Bolt decision. Ms. Russell mentioned the Bolt decision. Several years ago, I had a doctoral student here who was writing about the Bolt decision and some of the environmental aspects of that. And it flowed into a book we ended up authoring together called Law, Culture, and Environment. And we did case studies of management plans at several national parks and national forests. And we looked at what it made for effective negotiation and how tribes could have an effective voice in developing the management plans. And one thing we discovered was that when at Devil's Tower and at Medicine Wheel, when they brought Indigenous peoples in to the very beginning of developing the plan, it got a much better result. Most of these management plans were designed to last for 10 or 15 years. It would spend 8 to 10 years in litigation, and so they'd be almost obsolete by the time they were able to be implemented. And the agency had to pay for the cost of litigation. That's very expensive. And so it was when the agencies invited Indigenous peoples to the table from the beginning, then what happened was the end goal, even if it went to court, usually the suits were dismissed on much easier grounds, on standing grounds. And so took 2 to 3 years, the litigation to be resolved. And so it was much better from the selfish point of view for the agencies. It was cheaper for them to include tribes in from the beginning, and then also to implement their plans. They went into force, were able to use for the entire duration. And that sort of led me to looking at other case studies and figuring out how Indigenous peoples can incorporate their law and their traditions and their approaches. And I found, thanks to Dr. Ron Trosper, who actually going to moderate the next panel, he pointed me to some studies about forest management in the upper Midwest. And what the forest management did was the U.S. Forest Service was managing forests for the same objectives, biodiversity, as the tribes. But the tribes management processes and the tribal approach was much more successful in achieving that objective. And so what we have is, by bringing Indigenous peoples in, you not only have saving money and time, you also make it more knowledgeable information about how to manage the land. The tribes have a lot to contribute to co-management, in addition to protecting the sacred sites and making sure the sacred sites aren't spoiled as part of the public's use of the park or the monuments. There's a lot of benefits to co-management for the government. It's not just some of the benefit tribes, benefits the government to engage in these. And so one question that comes up is, how do you keep moving forward with co-management when the political process is constantly changing? And we heard a lot about the changes between President Obama and President Trump, President Biden. And so how do we keep going forward with these and keep the process, the progress being made, even in light of changing political realities? We go to Professor Mills. I'm sorry, I've rotated back to you. I think we need to rotate to you and ask
Sure.
you how you think the legal process can work and what do you see as the future?
Yeah. Well, and I want to add, I really appreciate your comments about the benefits of these arrangements too. I mean, as Majel said, the benefits of restoring buffalo to the lands pay off to the land, in addition to all the cultural connections and restoring tribal presence on the land. It's not just the federal government who benefits from these arrangements. It's every person with an interest in the health of our public lands and, frankly, the health of our natural environment, which seems to me to be everyone. So they pay dividends, I think, across the board. And that being said, the question would come about, right? Well, then why aren't there more of them? Because if they're beneficial, they're rooted in treaty promises or a trust relationship, or they make sense from a cultural perspective, particularly at Bears Ears. And I think that's where some of the obstacles and particularly the durability of some of these arrangements become challenging. And part of the issue, as you point out, is political winds changing, and that's because a lot of the ability or the authority for co-management arrangements, at least from the federal perspective, resides in agency discretion. And we, as Majel mentioned, we have an administration right now with chock full of Native folks who understand the relationship and the benefits of these arrangements and who are pushing the envelope forward in terms of encouraging the use of that discretion to support collaborative management, co-stewardship, co-management, and really pulling all the legal levers that they can, because there are a number of legal authorities that could be used right now, today, for federal agencies to engage in co-stewardship. Federal authorities within the public land management sphere, setting aside, as Majel mentioned, treaty rights and responsibilities, trust responsibility, all of those things which also support the use of collaborative management for these resources. So there's a number of things that could be done right now. And I think that really goes to the question of resiliency, at least in my mind, is that if there is momentum, and there certainly is, and I think particularly with this administration setting policy objectives and also calling for, I think this is an important piece of the most recent secretarial order, calling for personnel evaluation metrics within the federal agencies that would evaluate federal employees as to how they are implementing co-stewardship objectives, so that it matters for federal employees and agency employees in their personnel evaluations, whether they are doing this work and doing it appropriately to produce effective results. That is one way I think that is critical to thinking about the resiliency and continuation of this work. But even if the political winds were to change, and I think there's a lot of momentum and incentive to get as much done prior to the potential election, or the election and the potential change in 2024, because the more, at least in my mind, the more that these arrangements are working on the ground, and the more that Vice Chairman Andrews and the Bears Ears InterTribal Coalition is having standards by which things are actually being managed and using their platforms to educate folks about why this work is so important. And the more that the ITBC and Majel and her tribal partners are having bison return to tribal lands, and the more that folks at Chaco Canyon are working on management of that region, or Badger 2 Medicine, or the bison range being returned to, the more that this is happening on the ground and being effective, the harder and harder it's going to be for political winds to blow those achievements away. And I think that, to me, is the most effective way to overcome any political change or any change in policies or any change in approach, is just to do as much on the ground to build the relationship and have these working activities there, because that's what the way that the momentum is going to keep going. And I recognize that presents practical challenge, and there's always difficulty in terms of educating federal agencies who for so long have simply set aside or ignored or erased their obligations to tribal folks and the connections that tribal folks have to public lands. But I think that that paradigm is beginning to shift. And the more that overall sort of approach changes, and the more that folks are out there actually doing this on the ground, which you're hearing these great examples and others, the harder it's going to be for that to be rolled back, at least as a practical matter. Even if legal and political winds may change, the harder it's going to be to roll that back going forward.
Thank you. Ms. Russell,
Yes.
what do you see as the future of co-management agreements? What do you see as some of the obstacles? How can we overcome those obstacles?
Well, I'm actually really excited about the future of co-management, and we've had co-stewardship kind of tossed around also to tribes in regards to buffalo restoration. But, you know, it avoids us having to litigate some of these issues when we have this open door. You know, the whole, I guess, standing that InterTribal Buffalo Council has achieved in this whole discussion is because they did litigate. They litigated to end the slaughter of buffalo at Yellowstone, and that actually brought them to the table as an interested party. And so unfortunately, you know, we don't want to have to see litigation again to try to achieve these arrangements, these cooperative agreements with our federal agencies. But we have made inroads. We are now talking with the federal government about actually managing some activities within refuges and within parks. We're undertaking a bigger role on disease management and getting involved there. One of the things that I think has been key, which Professor Mills touched on, is we have people in key places that are actually thinking about how do we work better with tribes. And I have to say that at USDA, which is where you have management of Forest Service lands, there's been a total review. There's activity there to look at all of these agency programs and how do we rethink these programs to overcome barriers that may not even be there, but it's been the culture of the program, the culture of the agency to create some of these barriers. And I think that there's been now a movement to rethink some of these programs and look at, you know, how do we overcome and work together? That's new, that's refreshing. I see in the next 2 years, if we can pull these agreements together and like Professor Mills said, try to get them into writing, get them approved so that they're in place. And I think it's harder to undo them when they're in place. We're looking at doing some management within the parks, in terms of buffalo management and making key decisions. The other thing I think that's really important is I'm hoping that the government doesn't continue to consider tribes as special interest groups, that we're actually sovereign governments and that we actually come to the table with knowledge and history, expertise, and governmental authority. Many times in the past, our tribes are considered like a special interest group who has an opinion about a certain issue, but not necessarily regarding us as having that governmental authority. And I think that that's key. In fact, we've been told it would violate the FACA, you know, if we were allowed to give advice to an executive agency about a particular issue. And so I think we've got some movement around that. And the other thing is, you know, like with consultation, it took a consistent reauthorization of executive orders for consultation. Maybe we need some sort of executive order that is consistently reaffirmed for co-management, co-stewardship, and has some parameters in it, such as, you know, tribes are governmental agencies with governmental authority, and that we have standing basically to get into these agreements legally.
Yeah, one thing that I was in a meeting a couple of days ago where they said the law mandates consultation, but it doesn't mandate collaboration. And maybe that's what's needed is some mandating of structure for collaboration, not just sending out a consultation invitation, but actually listening to response.
I agree.
Professor Mills, from your perspective, is any are any legal changes needed, or is it just a matter of working with the agencies for the existing legal structure?
Yeah, well, I mean, in an ideal world, there would be a clear congressional authorization that avoids any agency concern about their authority to engage in these agreements, would encourage rooted in the trust and treaty relationship and the obligations that Majel mentions. Congress could tomorrow pass a bill that says we authorize federal agencies to engage in collaborative management with tribes, and here are the conditions. And there's models for how that would work, whether that's, 638 contracting could come. There's a long history of how that could work. There's, Hearth Act trust leasing as an example. There's the Indian Trust Asset Reform Act from 2016, which sets up a pathway. So ideally, if Congress were committed to moving forward, that could happen. But we all know the political challenges of moving anything through Congress these days, and the potential risks that may come along with that. But even if that weren't to happen, I mean, that would avoid any further concern. And it seemed to me really represent the full paradigm shift, where it would eliminate many of the, I think, agency inertia, misunderstandings, and reluctance or outright refusal to really engage the way that co-management, co-stewardship can move forward quickly and effectively. But even short of that, I mean, there's a range of legal options that agencies have. And although many of those may be rooted in agency discretion and how they exercise that discretion, I think that may also serve as a benefit in a lot of ways, because if that discretion is used in recognition and honor of the trust obligations that all of those agencies have to tribes, and in recognition and honor of, as the education process goes forward, the Vice Chairman Andrews mentioned, recognition and honor of those tribal values in those lands, recognition and honor of the management benefits of meaningful tribal voice in management decisions, recognition and honor of treaty rights and the associated benefits and ecological obligations that come along with those, then all of those legal authorities that are right now in place can be utilized to move that forward. And I think that's really what we're seeing, thanks to the advocacy of folks on this panel and across the country. We're beginning to see the way in which federal land management agencies, and thanks to folks in positions of power who are helping support that shift on the federal side, beginning to see that recognition that the way that the public land have been managed historically have simply excluded, erased, ignored, or avoided tribal concerns, even though those connections remain. And I think that shift to meaningfully incorporate all those tribal obligations, even within the context of the current legal framework, is really where the next step could be, short of congressional action. I will say that still comes with risk. And to me, the biggest risk, and maybe the elephant in the room, is how the Supreme Court will continue to view and chip away at regulatory authority of agencies and agency discretion. We've seen that with the major questions doctrine in West Virginia versus EPA. It remains to be seen how far the court may go to really undermine the exercise of discretion by agencies, the administrative authority that agencies have. And I think this is an area where folks really need to be strategic in terms of thinking about that. But I will say, there are a lot of decisions that could be made that aren't going to end up before the Supreme Court that could really meaningfully have impact in terms of tribal co-management, tribal co-stewardship across the public lands. And I think the momentum that is already underway and the movement toward that paradigm shift isn't going to stop, regardless of the potential for some of those risks to be litigated down the road. And that, to me at least, provides a lot of hope. The framework is there, the policy objectives are there. To me, it seems like now it's time for particularly federal agency folks to step up and really put those meaningful words and obligations to action, and building out work on the ground that's really going to change the paradigm going forward.
Thank you. Vice Chairman Andrews, what do you think is the biggest success the commission has had in here so far? And what would you like to see?
So the biggest success is to me is we're working on the alternatives is what they want to refer to. So I have one here, which was just recently submitted to the agencies. So they still have to comb through it with a fine-tooth comb. It's nothing, it's our input as far as the tribes that we're working with agencies. I see that as a positive. You know, we're at that point where we're beginning to see some things eye to eye. And they also realize the impacts that it has, all the tourism, everything that has impacts out on Bears Ears area. But you know, to come to the table to hammer out certain areas like this new alternative, it talks to all the natural landscapes, tourism, soil resources. I mean, it's got a whole. This is pretty thick, and this is what we've been working on every week. You know, it takes a lot of time with agencies, with us working together. So I think that's we're at a point where it's starting to gain some traction, but still nothing's for certain. Like I said before, you know, it's at some point in time, I would like to see the agencies on one side of the table with the tribes speaking to the president, whomever is going to have that decision power to okay, so this is how it's going to go, and just make it law, so nothing turns it back. So that's where my prayers are, that we sit on one side of the table and do that, because we're going to need them. We're going to need them at some point, even though, you know, we're kind of separating them as white or agencies and tribes, but at some point we're going to all just be one team to talk to that point. So I think that's a good movement forward. Like I said, this alternative that we just now submitted to the agencies, they're going to have some time to look at it, put in their input, and then we're going to come back to the table and work some more on it. So we're not gonna stop, and it's not gonna go anywhere. So even with tourists, I've told the commission, you know, it's there's areas out there that's being really impacted out there. So they're trying to put some kind of plans for tourists to route in and route back out and have some kind of tribal knowledge input that says it on a board, or they can have a little station there where they can teach the visitors to come in and to visit with respect. So that's the stuff that I would hope to see out there, not too far down the road there. Because even if we don't do anything, they're going to come. Visitors are going to come. They're going to impact it more. Or, you know, there's two choices. I told them, you know, at the commission meeting, and then we don't do nothing, or we do something about it, and we put all these plans in place, and get some kind of enforcement behind it, and have our own tribal departments looking into it, because we have a pretty good Department of Natural Resources, Hopi Tribe, and there's water resources, woodlands. We have monitors out there that's monitoring our Hopi reservation all the time for vegetation. We have people that do the cattle, you know, they do cattle count. So that way it doesn't impact the land out there. They have to rotate. What I see out there is ranchers out there that's been out there for years and years and years, and those are the ones that I believe that we're going to have a little bit of a challenge with, but not saying at some point in time we're going to have to meet with the ranchers. And I don't see that too far down the line, because that's really what's impacting out there. because they're competing with forage, with the deer, the rams, all the wildlife out there. They're competing with water resources. Even though that they're corralled, you know, we'll still hear that there's trespass livestock out. So those are the areas that we're putting into consideration. And one of these days, you know, if it comes to it, you know, a cattle reduction. But those are just kind of the things that we're looking into and talking about, and working with agencies, with BLM, especially with BLM and the Forest Service out there, so that way we can have a true impact and have a true native aspect of this whole management portion of it, co-management. We're all stewards. We're all stewards of the lands, no matter where you come from. And we should all be stewards of that land, any land that we come in contact with. So, you know, I that's what we're raised with. As far as, I guess personally for me, you know, that's kind of how I was raised. And we're all stewards of the land, and we should all care for Mother Nature. So I think that would be my answer to that.
Thank you. Ms. Russell, what do you see as the future of co-management? What would you like to see happen?
I think the future of co-management will allow Buffalo, well, it will allow a change in position on a lot of these federal lands to tolerate buffalo as a species that is appropriate in particular for a lot of these federal landscapes. And that's actually what we're looking at. We're looking at co-management is going to foster in a new generation of restoration of this keystone species in a much larger way on federal landscapes. And we just recently have had the Forest Service actually revise some of their Forest Service management plans to tolerate buffalo on the landscape. And so I think co-management is going to move forward with those sorts of doors being opened, so that in the case of buffalo, that they're back and healthy and vibrant on the landscape for all the conservation benefits that they can provide, as well as just restoring that animal back as close as we can to where it had been many years ago. That's where I think for InterTribal Buffalo Council, co-stewardship, co-management is hoping to be.
Thank you. Before we open for questions, let me let Professor Mills have a chance to do any concluding thoughts or comments you'd like to make.
Yeah, I don't have too much more to offer. I think that's where it's at, and whether it's buffalo across the landscape or as Vice Chairman Andrews said, the management of the resource in a way that reflects and protects those the longest standing connections to those regions. I think that's the future, and it may never be the case that there's perfect alignment between the federal approach to managing these lands and tribal approaches, but the more and more that tribal approaches begin to influence the federal approaches, which for so long have simply not reflected tribal values, the more I think we will all benefit from the management and future sustainability and just long-term health of the resource. And I think that matters from a natural resources perspective, and frankly, I think it matters from a long-standing justice perspective. And it is the obligation, I think, of all of us to help support ensuring a more just future for our national resource. So I just want to reiterate how great it is to be a part of this panel and hear all the great work that's going on the ground, and look forward to any questions that folks there may have.
For questions, do we have any questions?
Questions?
Post lunch, yeah.
I definitely ask a question, but actually it looks like maybe right behind you.
I do have one question from online for audience members. How can tribes effectuate co-management of tidal wetlands, putting land under marine waters as well as coastal areas?
I can
up with that. Anyone else?
I'll take a first crack at that. I mean, I think in some ways that's happening, particularly here in the Northwest with regard to treaty reserved rights and the role of tribes in managing treaty resources, whether that's shellfish, marine resources, and habitat connections that come along with those resources. And I think there's also, particular statutory obligations for co-management, like around MMPA and some of the Arctic resources around walrus. So there are some kind of focused statutory areas, but I think it's the same approach, right? They're outside of treaty reserved rights that may be a basis and outside of specific statutory authorities. Federal agencies responsible for engagement, whether it be the Corps or NOAA or NIMFS or other federal agencies outside of Interior who may be involved in the management of tidal lands, coastal lands, or even marine areas, they owe the same trust obligations to tribes as any other federal agency. And I think within statutory frameworks, it is likely the case that those agencies, just like public land agencies, have been engaged in collaborative relationships with others, like states or other nations, other interests, even private interests. And if they haven't been doing the same type of collaborative arrangements with tribes, there's still authority for them to do it, obviously, if they're engaged in these other collaborative arrangements. So I think there is room, again, in that agency discretion space for tribes to work with agencies around a collaborative arrangement. It may not be, as the federal government defines it, co-management, right? But I think in some ways that form of the federal government's technicalities around it can sometimes get in the way of the function of having a meaningful collaborative arrangement in those environments too. I'll just add one other is out there as well, and it's related, but it's not related. And that is, under this administration, at least, there is this America the Beautiful and 30 by 30 initiative to conserve 30% of the nation's lands by 2030. That, at least in principle and in objective, one of the principles of that initiative is to honor tribal sovereignty. And I think that is an important recognition. It's not just collaborate with tribes. It's not just work with tribes as stakeholders, as Majel mentioned, which is completely inappropriate. It is to honor tribal sovereignty. And so even and in that initiative, there's a significant focus on the oceanic environment, marine resources, et cetera. And so there may be other ways in which, relying on initiatives of the current administration, at least, tribes may be able to bring leverage around opportunities to engage in collaborative management that might not have been available outside of some of those more specific initiatives.
Good question. Good. Your comment, sir.
Yeah, just really quickly to respond to that last question about coastal areas and waterways. Announced at the Tribal Nation Summit, this last Tribal Nation Summit, November, December, Secretarial Order 3403, that was signed by Secretary Raimondo, who's the Secretary of Commerce, and then Commerce is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. So if a tribe is interested in co-stewardship, and that term was deliberate, it's meant to be an umbrella term, it's a broad term, inclusive term. But if a tribe is interested in co-stewardship opportunities, I would recommend contacting the local NOAA region. And then the co-stewardship information is on the White House Council on Native American Affairs website. So you just Google White House Council on Native American Affairs, you can see that information. And then you can also email, there's an email on there. If you're not getting a response, you can always email that one, will help with the response. Thank you.
We have another question from online. From an audience member who sees many agency NEPA proposals in their work. There's always a little paragraph at the bottom having to do with tribal consultation, stating that they sent a letter to the tribes asking for input, but they received no response. And we suspect that the agency just didn't try hard enough getting that consultation. So how can it make consultation in NEPA documents more meaningful?
One issue that I've heard from tribes is they get a lot of requests for consultation, and they have to govern too. They can't just answer consultation. Because tribes have to govern their communities. And the consultation agreements don't often come with enough notice or enough travel money or something to cover the expense of it. And so that's a problem and agencies think that just sending out the letter, and that's not. The consultation is actually has to be listening. But it's a problem because so many agencies are looking to consult with tribes. They just send stacks of paper. I talked to one tribal administrator who said she had a stack about 2 inches high of requests for consultation. She just didn't have time to respond to them.
So just another answer to that is, we, speaking for Hopi Tribe, we a little over about maybe 300 consultation letters within at least a couple of weeks, and those all have to be addressed. So we route those to the Cultural Preservation Office. But when we do get these consultations, we've talked to agencies about it. You know, it's what we tell them is a consultation is not consent to anything. You know, really, I think what they're doing is it's within their policy to send those out. So even if there was a response to it, it's just a little check off on their box. Oh yeah, we consulted them. You know, but really, that's kind of what we were telling them. Consultation isn't a consent for us, but you can do whatever you want consultation. So that's what we tell the agencies or whoever's sending those consultations. Yeah.
I don't want to ignore this head of the room. There's a question over here. We have time for 2 or 3 more questions, probably. There's a question back here.
On Petuwashte, Cassidy Schoenfelder, Machiapi. Hello, everyone, and good day. My name is Cassidy Schoenfelder. I'm a Oglala Lakota, and I'm a geography student here at the University of Arizona. Thank you, everyone. This talk is amazing. I'm researching co-management right now, and so I couldn't be more thankful that the symposium is existing right now. I'm coming at this from a slightly different perspective in that I'm interested in how a lot of the co-management practices are being represented to more of like the public facing and more of the larger social sphere. And a large part of that is because public lands for so long have impacted society's understanding, I guess more for the non-native understanding of people's relationship to place as being nature is separate from people. So I'm really excited to see how co-management could possibly disrupt that by restoring the land as a peopled place, and as it always has been. So I guess if anyone could speak to how, whether it's cultural, kind of like self determination through representation, how that is kind of being taken up in co-management. I know it's a little bit different of a question, but thank you.
Professor Mills? Yeah.
But I don't, if by Sherman Andrews was it?
Yeah. Actually, we had with working with agencies, that was a part of that. We had to do a lot of public scoping, you know, into areas on the management that we're proposing. So that was public input from all areas, businesses, ranchers, people who had possibly ideas out there, even just homeowners out there. So we've had a wide array of people chiming in. We had it in person in New Mexico, and then we had it another one on via Zoom, which was sent out to the public for public scoping. But there was a lot of people that chimed in for that purpose. So we are. It's going to come to that again. It's not going to go anywhere with all this management portions of it, and with all these alternatives. It's going to go back to that again with public scoping. So public's going to have a big input in it.
Just to add on that a little bit. I mean, I think that's an important, the question about what conservation means and what it's always meant to public land agencies and the non-tribal public is, I think, an important part of the paradigm shift that's underway. And particularly, I mentioned the 30 by 30 initiative. I think that's an example where the federal agencies have looked at that almost exclusively in terms of co-stewardship without thinking about tribal conservation itself of tribal resources and the ways in which tribes view use, connection, conservation as a sort of concept. So I think there's a lot of opportunities just in terms of educating about co-stewardship and also talking about the resource itself, and that, yeah, it's been managed this particular way. And that's how, you know, folks outside tribal communities may think about it. But that, number one, isn't the only way. And number two, may not even be the best way or the right way to be thinking about these resources. So I think it fits within the broader sort of paradigm. And the more, as you've heard from Vice Chairman Andrews, the more that those conversations are happening about what the resource is and what it means and how it can be used and connected and protected from a tribal perspective, the more I think that paradigm shift is going to continue.
Just build on that by making a couple of practical observations about Devil's Tower. When the management negotiations were happening, ended up in 1995, management plan of Devil's Tower. The religious leaders from the tribes were explaining the religious significance of Devil's Tower to the tribes. There were 17 tribes in the area that have connections to Devil's Tower. And the climbers were brought into their climbing equipment to show they weren't using the equipment anymore that hammered pitons into the sides of the tower. So that discussion and that sharing of why it's important to what kinds of equipment they use overcame some presuppositions and confusing assumptions that created the problem. But also, there's a documentary about the Devil's Tower called In the Light of Reverence. And it's a great documentary, and it includes an interview with the late Vine Deloria, who said, you know, everybody thinks that the tribes are trying to have exclusive access, exclusive control. And when it comes to sacred sites, that's not it. The idea is that these places are so sacred, they should have time of their own. And then when people who know how to minister to them should have time to come and do that. And that's not trying to take ownership or control of the site. That's just a different relationship to land, and a different way to connect with the land. And so you have to have the conversations to break through those preconceptions and those misunderstandings. That's why it's so important to have dialogue. There's a question about the row.
Okay, this will be the last question and we'll wrap up.
I have a question pertaining to how co-management is implemented in practice, and particularly as it relates to conflict resolution, not just between tribal stakeholders and federal agencies, but also local interests. So particularly, Ms. Russell, bison, you know, we have local ranchers who have these entrenched beliefs about how, you know, by transmission of disease and bison and fences, and how does that play out in practice on the ground?
Well, that's a very good question, and yes, highly controversial. Obviously, the greatest opposition to expanded restoration of buffalo to the landscape is the cattle industry. And so, you know, in fact, all of the policies in terms of limiting the number of buffalo in national parks and refuges is oftentimes influenced by risk to the cattle industry should those animals get out of those parks, or should the animals wander out. And that's actually the major issue at Yellowstone. So in the agreements that ITBC has developed, there is a specific process to address some of those concerns that deal with, you know, impacting or making sure that there is limited risk for any sort of impact on cattle and the cattle industry in the way that we're managing animals. And you can also see that in all of the expanded hunting that's taken place around Yellowstone by tribes. You know, there's been a lot of work by local landowner groups as well as tribes with the Park Service and with the state of Montana to try to figure out ways where all of those parties can reach some agreement to accommodate treaty rights, but also ensure that the property owners are protected. And so, I think that dispute resolution is also a key issue that you need to address in these agreements. And that's where you've got to have some strong advocates. We come at this and we are in a position where we haven't done these agreements a lot. We're still trying to basically expand and even explore the authorities that we have. And so then we have to get bogged down sometimes into dispute resolution, but they are key components. And some of the agreements that we have done do have usually, good faith discussions built right in when we have disagreements, and then maybe move into a mediation process and hoping to avoid even arbitration, because Indian tribes don't do real well in standard arbitration procedures, and hoping to avoid litigation. So I don't know if that's real helpful to you, but yes, that's a component that you have to be thinking about. And we've tried to build into some of these agreements.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you to all our panelists. And thank you to the audience member. Can I continue to break?
Okay.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, y'all.
Bye.